much of what we see in Europe's society today, perhaps in global society, and it is linked with a huge rise of nationalism and extremism everywhere, is this eternal search for an enemy. And the enemy is always the other. And Jews will always be the first ones to be at the receiving end of that logic. And so signs of anti-Semitism should not remain unaddressed. Hate speech is not innocent if you know anything about European history. Understanding of the exclusion of people is not something that can be avoided. So that's why I believe in this day and age, when so much is based on identity, when politics is no longer about community as community of differences where we interchange, but as community of exclusiveness, of getting together in a community without contacts with other communities. If then identity becomes a defining subject, then to define your identity, you need to oppose it to somebody else's identity. And who then becomes the target of that? We all know that. We are faced with a huge surge of anti-Semitism, which is inspired also by people coming from elsewhere who were raised with anti-Semitism. And it takes a long time for them to get that out of their system. And our society should be helping them to get it out of their system. But sadly, that's not the only form of anti-Semitism we face. It's the ancient, eternal European anti-Semitism that sadly is also alive and kicking. As Deborah Lipstadt demonstrates, not just in Europe, but also the United States, very often hiding in sort of these dog whistle type of remarks which target Jews in particular. And I think we should be very aware of this phenomenon and combat it. How can we solve that? You know, I have to be honest with you, 2 years ago I was very pessimistic about developments in Europe, about confrontation between communities and religions, about the success of this horrible, nihilistic, neo-Salafist ideology that wants to destroy everything we cherish. But I'm more optimistic today than I was 2 years ago. I see huge resilience in our society. I see an increasing understanding that we are really now fighting for the preservation of our values and of the way we want to live. This is no longer a joke. This is no longer something you can make light about. This is about the very survival of our diverse communities. And I honestly believe that the silent majority in European societies is now waking up to this reality, that if we don't stand up and fight for what we believe in, those who want to destroy a society based on diversity, and who are very determined to do that, and very vocal, will be increasingly successful. Looking for confrontations and scapegoating people and putting people in pigeonholes then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I believe to try and undiversify a European society is the same thing as trying to unscramble scrambled eggs. You can create a huge mess, but it will not be successful, whatever you try. And I believe if we want the diversity to be successful in our communities, we need to respect the differences we have. Celebrate our differences, not see them as a threat, not see them as a confrontation, but celebrate them. And I want to repeat what I've said many times, that one of the communities that is quintessential in Europe's future is the Jewish community. There is no Europe without the Jewish community. It is impossible. And of course, it is easy to look at the extremes in Europe's political landscape. But I think there is also danger in the slow assimilation of ideas of the extremes in mainstream parties that has me worried. There's also the decreasing understanding of what it means to be religious. And this affects all communities. It affects I was proud to say I am a Jew, and I would repeat it, but frankly, I'm not. I'm a Catholic, and this is not something... Hey, nobody's perfect. But when I say this, I also say that in my community, the understanding of religion is not something that comes easily anymore. And for many people of my generation and my kids' generation, religion can be something like a coat you put on and you take off. But if I think back of my grandparents, for them the church and religion was an existential matter. It was not just the God they worshipped, it was the community they belonged to. It was the very... If I had said to my grandmother, well, if you don't like this or that, leave the church. You can, drop it like an ideology or anything. She would have despaired, because that would have not just taken away what she believed in, it would have put her outside of her community and of her family and everything she cherished. And don't we sometimes underestimate when we criticize the Muslim community for some of their views and say, well, just drop that ideology? Don't we underestimate that these same processes can happen in other communities? We are not all in the same place in terms of how we see religion. And I believe that freedom of religion means that you get to say how you want to worship, but you don't get to say how somebody else gets to worship. And somebody else doesn't get the right to tell you how you should worship. That, I think, is freedom of religion. We at the European Commission, and I personally, will defend that principle. We'll defend that principle. And this also applies, Rabbi Gigi referred to it, applies to religious practices. These are not practices you can simply drop if they are an integral part of what you see as your religion. And if religious slaughter is done according to the rules by people who are trained to do that and certified to do that, that should never be a problem in any society, would be my point of view. Yes, our society has evolved. Yes, there needs to be much more attention for animal welfare than before. Nobody in this room, I believe, would disagree with me when I say that. But then let the facts speak for themselves. Let science speak for itself. And let scientists testify about suffering of animals when they are slaughtered, in a traditional way or in a religious way. And I think everybody deserves the ability to look at it in this way, as an integral part of what it means to be religious. And the same, I would argue, applies to the issue of circumcision. Rabbis, ladies and gentlemen, given the late hour, I will not test your patience much longer. But I want you to know that your contribution to who we are as Europeans is not just important, it's essential. It's essential. The Jewish community is like the canary in the coal mine of my grandfathers, who were both coal miners. Whenever there's a rise in anti-Semitism, there is a much, much, much wider and bigger problem behind it. It is just a signal of a much bigger problem in society. And we have that problem. The problem of exclusion, the problem of discrimination, the problem of not understanding what it is to be religious. That is a huge problem. The problem of not knowing how to handle an ideology that comes from outside, that is able to co-opt parts of our youth. Yes, yes, the murderers and terrorists who affect Europe today are part of our youth, are part of our communities. How can they embrace a nihilistic ideology that gives them the right in their minds to murder people they went to school with, to murder people they don't know but they encounter every day? It happens in the same process as what the Nazis did. You dehumanize. You dehumanize. The other is not the same human being as you are, so you can do terrible things to them because they're not like you. And that is why I believe that the contribution you give to us as a society, the part you are of our society, the lesson you teach every day, is that if we are anything, we are diverse. If we are to survive, we have to respect our differences. If we are to prosper, we have to let people be who they want to be. And if we are to not repeat the mistakes of the past, we have to make sure that history stays living history.